Hi everyone, good afternoon. So many familiar faces, that's wonderful. Thank you for joining us today, this slightly windy but beautiful day as the spring is kind of teasing us. Again, my name is Ilter Ibrahimof, co-founder and artistic director of Fall for Dance North Festival, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Dance Collection Dance's 2019 Encore Dance Hall of Fame inductees panel discussion. We'll work on that for next year. In a few minutes, we'll invite our panelists to join us. But before that, on behalf of myself and I'm sure everybody in this room, I do want to take a moment to thank Dance Collection Dance and the wonderful people who run this vital organization, Miriam, Amy, Vicky, Jay, and Michael, for relaunching Dance Hall of Fame to recognize and celebrate the stellar people who have made significant contributions to the Canadian dance history and industry. So let's give them a round of applause, please. This year's inductee list, as you know, is indeed very impressive for the high quality talent and the diversity that it covers, which is a perfect match for the principles for Fall for Dance North Festival. And that's why I was very happy and excited when Vicky called and asked if we could co-host today's activities, the workshops and the panel. And I'm especially pleased that it is taking place here at the Ryerson School of Performance. As you might know, our festival started a partnership with the School of Performance last year, where we do a lot of workshops in this place and also host main stage performances at the Ryerson Theatre. So it's a pleasure to be here, as always. And I'll also take this opportunity to thank the School of Performance for donating the space for today's event, and once again the K.M. Hunter Foundation for sponsoring it. So let's invite our panelists. Officially, we have until 5 p.m., which is not a lot of time. So when I introduce them, I will introduce their names and where they are visiting us from, instead of their full bios, which would take the entire hour or more. So Lois Brown from St. John's, Newfoundland. David Earle from Guelph. Louise Lecavalier from Montreal, Quebec. Elder Margaret Harris from Kitwanga, BC, along with Margaret Grenier from Vancouver, BC. Last but not least, our very own Michael Crabb from Toronto. I think we have one microphone. Right? Two. Okay, two microphones. So what I'd like to do is to guide this conversation with a couple of questions and then open it up to the audience as well. And we're so lucky to have on this panel representation from different regions of Canada. It's a big country, as we know, and it becomes sometimes generally not so easy to keep up what's happening in different areas. Funding models change, and touring models change, and new festivals and platforms and presenters emerge, and sometimes they disappear, and it's hard to keep up. So I wanted to start, and I do realize that we're on this panel missing 6 out of the 10 provinces and all the territories, but still I think it would be interesting to do a bit of a regional checkup, if you will. And I just wanted to ask each one of you, what's exciting you about the dance scene where you live at the moment? Maybe we can start with Louise and maybe go down the line.
Somebody told me it was going to be a piece of cake. cake, but it's really not. It's a huge question. I wish I would have heard before. You wanted to talk about the whole Quebec scene of dance? It's
Not
about.
really, but I think what's perhaps some of the things that are happening right now that's exciting you.
Okay. In the world or in Quebec?
In Quebec, I'm sure I'm specific.
Okay.
You can talk about it.
Okay. Well, sometimes at one point in your life, when you work so long as me, you go very point. It's not that it closes to everything else, but you need to focus and continue digging in what you're working on. So I go see lots of things, and there's lots to see in Montreal. So I don't see lots, I see some. Because if not, I would spend my time every day going to see every show. Because there's really lots of things. I think there are lots of good things happening. People older than me continue, people 60 my age continue, people 50 continue, people with all level of age continue performing. So really I don't know how everybody can be presented everywhere. But I think it's still happening, so I think I know I'm out of the subject a little bit, but I think that people presenting shows, they must have a really, really, really hard job because there's so much stuff happening. So how to choose, who to invite, and so on. You know, people that are stars, that are well known, or people that are really beginners starting. So there's lots. In Quebec, there's lots happening. But I cannot speak of one group in particular. It would be unfair to all the other groups. But I can continue thinking and speak after.
Okay. What excites me is that we are able to bring all nations into our dances, teaching them our dances and our songs. Our songs and dances tell stories, how to behave as young women, how to behave as mothers, and how to respect Mother Earth. So this excites me because I've also been up to Alaska to teach songs and dances. And I also teach my own Cree songs and dances, and that's, I'm able to teach Jewish girls, Asian girls, from all nations. Thank you.
I guess I'm supposed to speak for Toronto/Ontario. And in a sense, as an outsider, as an observer of the dance scene, and one with a long history in it, sort of 40 years or more. And there are a lot of changes, and some I think are good, and some I think regrettable. One of the regrettable ones is the disappearance of companies as we used to remember, where there was a stable base and an ability to do more than just work project to project, where there was secure employment for dancers, whereas today it's a different model, and essentially there is a pool of independent dancers who put together a career by working on different projects with different choreographers. It's just an ecological change. I'm not quite sure whether it's a progressive one or not. But the real, one of the things that has happened is the total lack of adequate resources for, to my mind, companies to be able to invest the time required to produce a work to the level it deserves. So I tend to see a lot of work which shows huge potential, but which I know is somehow half-baked and requires more time, more resources, which simply don't exist because rehearsal space is expensive. They don't have the budget to keep dancers around for as long as they would like to be able to work a piece up to the level that they ideally would like it to achieve. I see this continually, and I find it disappointing. And that is a reflection of the funding base, which is inadequate. We have to remember that in terms of private donations, in terms of government funding, The arts is always at the bottom, and within the arts, dance is about as far down as you can go, along with poetry and visual arts. So it is a funding issue, and there's no question in my mind that looking back, when relatively speaking the funding proportionally was more generous, the production level of work was greater. So I see a lot of real talent just wanting to do all kinds of exciting things, but being in a sense hamstrung and not having the resources that they deserve to be able to achieve that. And that's, from my perspective, as an older observer of the dance scene, I don't think that's a progressive thing. Then, of course, on the other hand, because you basically, when you're looking at the dance in Toronto, you're looking at two whole different realms. There's the big ballet, which is essentially a commercial operation, and then there's the rest, which is struggling. Now, the ballet is struggling too, but they, in the sense that they're always sailing close to the wind, but they can put on another Alice's Adventures in Wonderland or Pinocchio or any kind of bums-on-seat crowd pleaser, and forget about the days when they would do a whole evening of George Balanchine or an evening when they did 3 brand new ballets all by Canadian choreographers. They're so driven now by box office, because it represents such a crucial part of their income, that they have to put on things that are going to fill a 2,000-seat house over a minimum of 7 performances, and sometimes 13 performances, as we just had with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, which is the sort of March break nutcracker.
It seems to me, not only in dance but in other live art forms as well, that there are these senses that every bit of time has to be used extremely productively, and there's no time for reconsideration or just a latent thought or maybe a walk in the nature to just give a little bit more, I guess, thought to, am I going in the right direction or not? And I think that's something that you just touched on, Michael. But I want to say some interesting things that are happening is, in the past year, that I personally felt, is links to Halifax, and I mentioned Corner Brook, smaller places, that had been eroded since we first initiated them back when Diane Moore was founded Live Art and Lee Saunders was doing work in New Brunswick. They seem to, through Kinetic North and some work by Jacinthe Armstrong, to have sort of started to reform, I hope, just, little baby steps. The other thing that's happening in our community that's really interesting is that there is a focus on disability arts aesthetics. And I find that really interesting because that was one of the things that made me enthusiastic about dance practice in the late 70s and 80s, was the sense of open access, democratized bodies, interest in difference, a direct connection to what is embodied, because we saw, I understand the grief over the loss of some of these companies too, but that was a time when we saw independence, the Canada Council start independence, and then right away we saw dance practitioners choreographing on their own bodies and bringing an authority to their body. That was really interesting. And then at that time, we started to see a lot more female choreographers and choreographing on their own bodies and hearing their voices, and that was a really exciting time. And I see that disability arts aesthetics are emphasizing some of those same things in our community, and that's something I find exciting.
So I'm in Guelph, and Guelph has a dance festival and a young people's program of training, and we're still teaching classes. Suzette teaches Sunday, I teach Wednesday, and we have had a collection of very beautiful young women for 10 years, who all had babies last year. So I'm a grandfather 5 times. But it's interesting what Louise was saying, because, you know, our art form is the only art form in which young creators have no access to what preceded them. Peter, Trish, and David in New York saw maybe 40 significant dance artists almost daily for years. You would go to the Graham Company every night for 3 weeks, or the Moore Company every night for 3 weeks. Cunningham, I mean, there's a list I made of those 40 people whose work we saw before we made up a single step. And here in Canada, unfortunately, all the works from the past are lost. People are trying to make up an art form from scratch, and some of them are doing very well. But it's really an unusual situation. If you were a writer, a painter, or a composer, you would have access to everything that preceded you. You would have heard it all your life until the moment you decided to create. So and the other thing I want to say is just that that's essential for a beginning artist. But once you have chosen your path, the last place you look for inspiration is your own art form. It's very, very hard. It's very hard to look at other people's work, and I say to them, if you ask me what I thought of your work, you'd learn more about me than you would about the work. Because I have to be completely subjective. Because if I'm going to go back into the field to fight again, to create, I have to hold on to the values I had. I think of Monet, who survived Expressionism, Cubism, Surrealism, without having it affect his work. His own style deepened and deepened and deepened right up to the water lilies. And that's something that I find is very bizarre, is that there's an impression that's given that one should switch to the current style. And I think that would be a great loss. So,
I'll just speak from the perspective of as an Indigenous dance artist based in Vancouver. And I think what I would say strikes me about what I see in dance right now, coming from Vancouver, but also I don't think only there, is there is a transformation that's happening. And it's allowing dance to become more inclusive. And I think that especially when considering our Indigenous dance practices, we struggle with a lot of fear. That's what I've encountered, is there's a lot of fear on how to hold a space or support Indigenous artists, or ensure that that is an equally weighted part of our dance community. And I think that what I appreciate and what I see happening right now is that people are making themselves vulnerable and making themselves open and allowing for things to happen that I know from my own personal experience certainly weren't happening 4 years ago, 5 years ago. So places where we literally were not part of a festival or part of a community, that is changing. And I think that's more than just exciting.
Can you talk a little bit about when you started that company, some of the dreams that perhaps that you had, and if you, at that time we were maybe looking into the 20, 30, 40 years, and what did you want that company to become? And then I would like to ask Margaret after that to comment a little bit about the very different structure that your dance company, Dances of Down Muhammad, has in terms of its structure, that is family-based, and how, you know, the differences, how you maintain that kind of company.
I mean, it was Woodstock, it was Rochdale, it was the age of permission when we started. I mean, it astonishes me that we could have created a company that lasted a quarter of a century, sharing the stage with each other, no competition, only support for each other's work, dancing in each other's work. It was really, I think, an amazing realization of 3 artists who were willing to have one work each on every program. And that we managed to sustain that for 25 years is really incredible. Trish had been dancing with Pearl Lang, Peter was dancing with Martha and with Jose, I was in the Limon Company. And I sort of felt that the time had come to come back to Canada and to give what we had been given by those people, because I felt that both of them had a vision of the scale of significance that dance could have, and we wanted to attempt to reach those heights together.
Well, the Dancers of Dan Mohammed started well before myself. It started in 1967, and at that time there wasn't any dance. There wasn't an ability for people to practice, and the practice had taken place prior to the potlatch ban. It was something that had been maintained within our feast halls for thousands of years. But when the ban lifted, it left things open to how this was going to reemerge. Within our family, we were fortunate to have my grandmother, Irene Harris, who was a matriarch and a carrier of this knowledge, and the work of my late father, Chief Kenneth Harris, my mother, Elder Margaret Harris. And what I didn't realize until I was older was to bring the dance as performance and share it publicly was a huge artistic risk that generation took. They took something that was held by protocol and a feast system that was intact for many generations, and they found a way to keep the dance alive through performance. Without that, I would not have grown up with song and dance. I would not have received the training that I did. And when I began to work and take a more leadership role of the dance company, it was with my sister niece, Toby Wick, and we were based out of Vancouver, and we had grown up with this privilege of the songs and dances and this practice, which really shapes your identity, who you are. How are we going to do it in this context? And we literally went to people that we knew and who we cared for. Karen Jamieson was one of those people. And we said, this is what we need to do, and how are we going to do it? And so we started our first dance production. We went to Myrna, at the dance center, the Scotiabank Dance Center. They offered their support. We were provided space. We were supported in putting together a grant. We looked at how the grant laid out its criteria. We figured out how to put a production together. And the Dancers of Dan Mohammed reemerged in that way. But it became clear that it was more than carrying forward songs and dances. It became clear over time that it was the practice. How to maintain the practice, how to live the practice, and be the connection that's going to carry that practice forward.
And I can't remember when, it's not that long time ago you decided to become an independent artist and started to choreograph for the first time and put your own productions out there. So what was that like, to making that decision? Because I'm sure there were some certain responsibilities that you didn't have on yourself, being part of a company and then becoming an independent artist. There was just so much more to do in terms of producing your own work, touring your own work, finding the funding, and maintaining this sort of new line of work?
Well, if you think about creating works and all, I was aware of that even when I was working with Edward, because at the beginning we were a very small group of people, and there was a specific role for choreographer, which was Edward's role, but besides we were all, not all, but I was very close to Edward, and I was touching a little bit of everything, and I was really aware about all the organization you have to do for a company. And the more I got busy with the dance, perfecting the dance and perfecting myself as a dancer in the style of Edward, I saw how fast he was evolving as a choreographer, and I needed to be up to the level. So I concentrated more on being the dancer. And more people came to the company also because there was a little bit more money, so we didn't have to do everything ourselves. So that's why it took me a long time after I left to think of making something myself, because I thought it's lost to be the choreographer and the dancer, because I saw what I gave up touching and Edward continued doing, and I thought if I have to do all of this together, it's too much. So when I quit the company in 1999, I first asked people to choreograph for me. First worked with Ted Robinson, and then a few other choreographers. And gradually, because the choreographers were not on tour with me, and sometimes they make it work. Well, not Ted, because Ted, it went really, really well together, and it was a short work, and he was dancing with me at the beginning, so we could fix this thing together. But after, when people gave me works, and sometimes they make it in 3 weeks, and I would tour them for 2 years, so I had to get involved and perfect things as they needed to be perfected during the voyage of the dance. And I realized I had more capacity than I thought to do that, to arrange lights, to adapt the movement. Well, I did it especially for a 1-hour piece that someone created in 6 weeks. And this is really hard, 6 weeks to make a 1-hour piece for 2 dancers. And the piece was not excellent. I didn't know that. I just liked to work with this choreographer, and I thought the piece was okay. But then I heard, okay, people next to me didn't really like it, even if people bought it. And I thought, maybe I will fix it, because people told me, cut. I thought, no, I don't want to cut. I want to add, maybe, or do it differently, or push it further. And I realized I had lots of pleasure to do that. It was in my body, because I did that before I worked with Edward. I was making my own works. I was dancing after dance class when I was studying in New York. After I did a 2 hours class, I had more energy and more desire to dance differently. And so, I'm lost. But anyway, so I had all this in me, and I rediscovered that, yes, when I was fixing, in a way, the works about the choreographers. Not that they did their job wrong, but it has to be, when it's so specific, it's for me and one other dancer, it has to grow with us. It cannot stay fixed, like, oh, this is a perfect choreography, and we'll keep it like this for 2 years, not touch it. So finally, I thought I was getting shy to ask more people to make works for me. I thought, oh, it's a big pressure for them. So I thought, maybe I should do it myself. And I tried. And finally, I really liked it. Like, the first piece I officially made, let's say, the first piece I officially made was So Blue. And I worked for 6 months improvising, hours in studio. And I thought, there's one thing that I must do is go every day. And don't get discouraged and don't judge myself. Because I never judge a choreographer in front of me. But myself, it's a bit more difficult not to judge. So, but I managed to do it and really went to the studio every day, improvising, not filming myself. And I was thinking, I could improvise a show. But then I really know myself, I know I'm too anxious and everything, and I must choreograph it. So 3 months before the premiere, I said, today, as the rehearsal person, can you write down when I'm going to start? And tomorrow I might change everything, but let's start like this. And that's how it started, and she was like, wow, it's great. Continue. And I kept going, and she wrote, and then we had the piece I made in a week almost. Like, I knew where it was going because of all this exploration for 6 months, and suddenly one movement led to another kind of thing that had worked, and I I needed an element, it was there. So it was pleasurable, difficult and pleasurable. So it was a wonderful experience. And to do all the rest around the creation nourishes the creation. The text you have to write, the thinking, the interviews, it's a chance, because when you're the dancer, and well, as a dancer I was lucky because sometimes people ask me questions also, but it forces you to think and give an answer, not just answer in your head all the time. Because as a dancer you question yourself, but well, not all choreographers are very talkative, so there's not necessarily a big exchange of words, but when you have to talk, you work to presenters, to everyone, it nourishes me. It forces me to go further. And I really like this. So that's why I keep dancing, and I'm 60 now, because I'm discovering new pleasures.
I wanted to ask Lois and Margaret to, one of the ways that you contributed to your community was to be part of starting a festival in your community. So that's a bit different than being an artist and creating and touring, but adding something to your community with a formal festival. So can you talk a little bit about that process and how you see that festival grow?
So you're talking about the Festival of New Dance, which is presented by Neighborhood Dance Works. Neighborhood Dance Works was founded as a company by Kathy Ferry, and she taught classes, and some of us attended those classes, and then we became people who created work that we would present as a company. And most of us, there was, for example, somebody who had worked in clown, Minnie Malone, and there was someone who worked in costumes, so her work was derived from the making of costumes, Peggy Hogan. So that was sort of the genesis of the group Neighborhood Dance Works. And then Kathy Ferry moved to Paris. Oh, I will say before that, one of the odd things was, at that time, you could get a grant to bring in someone from any other country as long as it was in Canada. And that's how Neighborhood Dance Works brought in Sarah Sheldon Mann, and she choreographed on us, and then we created a work, also within a week. And then shortly after that, the Independence program was created by Canada Council, which I mentioned. And so we were able to have some funding. And then Kathy had moved to Paris, and I wanted to keep the funding for our community. And I think one of the impulses for me was that I wanted to bring in other people who were making original dance so that we could see what else was going on in Canada. But I also wanted I didn't want to wait till once or twice a year when we would see original dance. So I also wanted to encourage my community to make dance and to be creative, so we could see pieces more often, mainly. And I didn't really care if it sort of failed. Sometimes that's okay, because we were at home, and we didn't care. We were all in it together. And then eventually the company, so in keeping going after Kathy left, she was sort of the impulse for the company. I started to curate and present a series. And I would present, we would have a dancer come in, like Terrell, and we would present her on an evening also with another dancer or a dance practitioner from Newfoundland, from St. John's, so that we bring the local person, would see the local dance practitioners and performance artists and performative arts workers would see someone doing work from Canada. And then we would, I know we're part of Canada. I don't mean to imply we're not a part of Canada. But the local audience would come out, would not necessarily know who that person is, even though they would be famous and well known in the dance community in Canada. And so the local people would come out to see the local artists. And then what actually happened with the festival was that I wanted to move on into this other position for a while, and to work in theater for a while. And so, I was doing the festival with Marlene Cal, the administrator, and Ann Anderson. And I asked Ann to take it over, and she thought it would be a bit challenging. And I said, well, why don't you make it into a festival? So she made it into a festival. There's a lot of festivals going on because there was a lot of festival funding. I mean, sometimes we know this. I don't know that we do know it. I don't know if we have even now the vocabulary to talk about it in the respectful way that we need to. But a lot of times we just need some money and then it'll happen. Just not even that much money sometimes, but yeah, a little bit more would be better. And so that's how the festival came about. And then it went from, then Anne went to work as the executive director of the Newfoundland and Labrador Arts Council. And so I still didn't want neighborhood dancers to go, so I took it back for a while. And then Anne Trope took over, and now Calla LaChance is the executive director, and it's really almost gotten a little bit big. And I think what's going to happen now, what we were talking about last week, was that we do something called First Look, which is for people who are want to present work in progress, which is so important. So important for developing audiences, so important for developing the work. And so we were talking about maybe we would have another week, sort of festival-like, but not a festival, but a week of presenting works in progress. So, okay, I'm going to stop there.
Works in progress. Connected to Margaret's. Coastal First Nations Festival, I was lucky enough to be there this year, and it's just such a wonderful event. Can you talk a little bit about how that started and what kind of impact it makes in the community?
The festival, we didn't call it the Coastal at that time in principle, but we called it Indian Day because we were called Indians. Now we're Indigenous, and then we're First Nations, so I really don't know who I am. We asked the Civic Center if they would give us room to start a festival. And so they said yes. We charged 50 cents a person to get in. We made over $1,000. So we had, I don't know if anybody knows what soulberries is, but I got I got a couple of women from the Lions organization. I was president of the Lions then. And one was the accountant from City Hall, and one was an alderman's wife from City Hall. And so they were whipping up my soulberries. And they were not Indians, they were white ladies. And they said, you don't even know how to whip up soulberries, but we do. For 8 hours they whipped up soulberries for me. That was the beginning of my festival. So the next year we moved to Fisherman's Hall, and I thought, well, no, this is a lot of work. I'll cook for lunch, and when I got the church AWLs involved, and they did the dinner. So I learned to get everybody to work. And we never ever got funding, and I thought, well, we got to make money, right, for the regalia. So what we did, we ran a bingo, and then once the dancers started to learn how to dance, I would say to them, you got to be a good, she'd confirm it over there, you have to be a good dancer or you're not going on stage. And what they made from dancing, or maybe $200, went back to regalia. So even when I moved to Vancouver, I started a group there. We never got funding, but we're still in existence 30 years. And people always ask me, I say, well, I just go around bumming. That's how the festival started.
And you use the drumstick on our heads.
Also, when Mom started, there wasn't any practice. Like there was no dance. There was not just within our family or in our community. There just wasn't any dance at all. So it's a very humble description of how the festival started. And because of the work that was done at that time, I always remember song and dance. I don't remember ever being old enough to have to start learning it, because it was something that was there from probably before I could walk. And then in 2008, we began the Coastal Dance Festival in Vancouver because I wanted to continue that I saw my parents carry for a number of years. And it wasn't, the festival is not about, it's not about presenting work so much as it's about sustaining and nourishing the dance form. And we have artists from throughout the coast. We also have Indigenous artists that come from various areas of the country, as well as international Indigenous artists. And for many, it's something that we all look forward to because it's a gathering that strengthens our practice. It's something where we get to experience what one another is working on, what we're, the strength of the artistry that's taking place is something that's strengthening our own, not only our own practices, but our families. And so that's really been the incentive to do a festival that we actually don't get extra funding for. It's something that we do out of our core. It's something that we, if we didn't do it, we wouldn't be any worse off. In that sense, it's something that we're doing because I think it's probably one of the most important things that needs to be carried with what we do.
Thank you. Before we open up to maybe a few questions from the audience, my last question will be about archival process. Actually, I'm curious to know how you all work in sort of different disciplines.
When David talks about, artists today feeling they have to reinvent the form, well, this is more or less what's happening. A, because they don't have the resources to be able to go back and see what's already been achieved. Secondly, I detect a certain lack of concern in terms of understanding the heritage, because everybody stands on shoulders. And as George Balanchine said, I don't create, God creates. I assemble. It's all there. I just assemble. And I think originality is grossly overrated. And there is so much that has been lost that is irretrievable. I mean, years ago, Dance Collection Dance was the origin, Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, the Encore project, when they literally resurrected and preserved works of Canadian choreography that were at risk of being totally lost. There should be more of that. I mean, the Balanchine Trust, which of course is very well funded, I mean, they are so well organized in terms of going back to people who created roles in Balanchine ballets, videotaping their recollections, demonstrating steps, how it was. That's the part of the, if you like, the heritage that needs the most attention.
Peter, Fish, and David are in a bit of a challenging situation because when our company was taken over, the board of directors gave all of our possessions to York University without consulting us. So in preparation for the event tomorrow, I had to say that the dance collection said they don't have access to the York file. So I don't know what's there. I mean, I think the board couldn't tell the difference between founders and hired artistic direction. We never had a contract with TDT. So, I mean, that's where everything is. I personally have written every day of my life. So, in fact, I was reading 1976 yesterday, where I met Paul Andre and Edward Locke. for the first time. Paul Andre was 28, and Edgar was 22. So it's all there, but perishable, as we all are. So yeah, I mean, you know, when I think of the works, like I do an earlier national ballet. I mean, I partnered Miriam at the school in our one of the evenings in my 4 years of training there. But the ballet at that time, the Tudor works were incredible. I mean, I would have to say, yes, I was inspired by modern dance greatness, but I was inspired by ballet greatness. We saw Balanchine regularly in New York, and Jerome Robbins. Those early years of the National were very great, I think. Angela Lee, Lois Smith, and David Adams, Lawrence Adams. They did wonderful, wonderful ballets that had a huge effect on me. Lilac Garden will always be in my heart forever. So I think it's so important to be able to see the greatness that preceded us.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, this is sort of very tangential, but I mean, I can remember my experience of seeing your work, and I can remember my experience of seeing La Human Steps, and you recently at the dance festival. Yeah, gosh, Amy. I'll have to talk to you about that. Well, I'm just going to tell this horrible story that recently I went to look at a piece that I had made with water called Queen of Swords, because I'm now sort of thinking of my earlier work as studies and going back and looking at it again, and I want to work with water and archipelagic thinking. And so it was a VHS, and I went to all this trouble, and actually you can barely see me at the beginning of the piece, and then the video drops to the feet of the audience, and then I don't know if the whole thing fell over, maybe? We're more advanced than that. And I'll just let people who, I mean, it's a really important part of my work. Like, for me, when I'm working, I go in, I think of something, and then I record it, and I journal it, and I video it, which it's a privilege to be able to do now, because I couldn't do that when I was first starting out. And then I analyze it and repeat whatever sticks and go back. But as for the incredible work that Dance Collection Danse is doing, no, I don't think we are up to standard.
Margaret, can you say a couple of words about, like, in your traditions, how do you sort of record?
Well, there's two things I'd like to say with regard to that, because I think that there has been such an importance in documentation that has taken place, and within our family, a story about my father's mother, Irene Harris. She archived hours and hours of song, dance, and story in our language, and the older language as well, Somalia. She did that, and that became the archive that carried our family forward when we went through so much opportunity to lose it within a generation. And so I completely value what it is to have something like that that holds knowledge and documents. But I think also what I have been taught and trained is that the documentation of this is within us. We hold it in our body's knowledge, our embodied knowledge, our training, and more so than even just knowledge as in terms of language or information, but in terms of epistemology, in terms of way of understanding, perceiving, and all of that, I think, is ingrained with the practice, and ultimately that is the most important documentation, because if we only have those archives, then we become close to not having anything, which is what has happened. So So I think this is this is where it's most importantly documented.
And finally, Louise.
Well, for me, it's just me, so now I do record what I'm doing with an iPad, but I don't do it for archives. I do it for myself to see how to improve things and make them go further. But eventually, it's some kind of document that can stay. But also, recently, someone did a film, and I accepted to do the film in the end because if they were filming lots of dance and not so much talking. So he did that. There's lots of long sections of dance and not edited, long shots. So it's a record. But for the period of time I was with La La La, I tried at the beginning to be the one collecting things because they were just falling on the floor, text or whatever. But after I disengaged from that, and I think everything is lost. But Edward kept a few things that he liked the most, but the rest I have no idea where it is.
On that happy note.
Can I say one more thing? Which is, when I was in New York, Bertram Ross, who was Miss Graham's partner, said to me that she had told him that when she died, she wanted all evidence of her work destroyed. And I was shocked. I said, that's impossible. It doesn't belong to her anymore. Those are her children. She put them into the world. They belong to us. But then I saw what happened to her work after she died. And I understood that somehow she had a premonition that perhaps things might end up in the wrong hands. And that what I have seen, I know that undoubtedly there have been great artists doing her work, but what I have seen is so exaggerated, so ballet, so extreme. Legs are here that used to be here, lifts here that used to be here. And also the fact that the company, when I was there, were the teachers in the school. And they were all ages and races and a very incredible group of characters. And it was their character that she built on in creating roles as much as the movement. And to see people who don't seem to possess character performing the same works, they lose their meaning. So I'm just saying this because I think it's best to do whatever can be done to salvage the work while the creator is alive.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's an honor to sit with you all and talk to you. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, DCD, for hosting it. And so tomorrow is, just to repeat, tomorrow is the Dance Hall of Fame induction ceremony at the Globe and Mail Center starting from 4 p.m. So if some of you don't have your tickets, you can talk to anyone from Dance Collection Dance about tickets, and we do hope to see you there. Thank you so much.